How old were you when Martin Luther King was killed?
Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee on April 4th of 1968. My birthday is on April 8th. I was born in 1953, so I was just 4 days shy of being 15. I was 14, just about to turn 15 when he was assassinated.
Okay. And what other events were going on at the time?
Oh boy, you had, as far as the civil rights movement, that was kind of not the culmination, but that was right in the middle of everything happening. Of course, you had had the very famous speech in 1963 by Martin Luther King, the I Have a Dream speech, and Dr. King was leading one faction of the civil rights movement. There were a lot of other factions that were going on. Some were very militant. The Black Panthers were one of those. There were a number of other organizations who were advocating violence to get to further their civil rights cause. Dr. King always preached nonviolence. So you had these competing groups that were militating for civil rights. Again, some advocating violence, others like King not. Of course, this was the real hot time in Vietnam. It was a very active period. That was about the period when we were involved most deeply in Vietnam in terms of the number of troops who were there at the time. There was a crossover between the civil rights in Vietnam, and the two were connected with each other. I suggested earlier that you might want to look at another one of Dr. King's speeches, which was very important and not quite as famous as the I Have a Dream speech, but it was called Beyond Vietnam, and it talked about the civil rights and how the civil rights played into the Vietnam War protests and the anti-war sentiments. So the two biggest things you had in the 60s with the civil rights was the war in Vietnam.
Okay. What was the general feeling in Washington about Dr. King?
You know, there were everybody, well, not everybody, there were different opinions of Dr. King. A lot of people saw him as someone, certain segments viewed him as being communist-inspired. It really depended where your politics were, and not only politics, but back in those days, there was much more of a racial polarization, a racial division. This was really coming on the heels of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, where a lot of laws were changed to give equal accommodation to both blacks and whites. You had a very, primarily in the South, you had people who were used to a certain social stratification, and it was based in part on, I suppose, the economy back in the 17 and 18 and early 1900s, where blacks were primarily in agriculture. And of course, we had slavery back then. You had those people who were less sympathetic to extending equal rights to blacks. So you had that faction. You had the faction who were more I'll say progressive, or more interested in seeing equal rights being extended to everyone regardless of their race. So within those two major groups, or two biggest divisions, you had people that were felt very strongly, less strongly, and so you had probably hundreds of different opinions as to how the movement should go forward, or if it should at all.
Okay. So you said he was pretty well known, but as we know how famous people are today with television and things like that, how was he known most? Was it newspapers or the radio, or what was really what made him famous?
You know, back then, of course, we're talking about the 60s, he was, his heyday, if you were, his peak in popularity was probably from around 1960 until he was assassinated in 68, at least as far as a national figure. Of course, he'd been more of a regional figure long before that in the South. but he came into national prominence leading his particular movement. Back in those days, we did not have the internet. We had nowhere near the types of communications, mass communications we have today. Primarily, as I recall now, again, I was just a young teenager at the time, but as I recall, the major sources of news and news coverage that existed were television, radio, newspapers, and magazines. So I remember as a young child when I would watch the news, the evening news, which back then, as I recall, was only 15 minutes in the evening. I would see coverage of the civil rights movement on the evening news when I'd watch it with my parents. I wasn't a big newspaper reader at that age, but I know it was covered extensively in the papers and like I said, in magazines and on radio too. I'll tell you, Sarah, one thing I do remember, and I don't mean to digress too much, but when I was much younger, I was born in 1953, until about 1963, I grew up on military bases. And it seemed to me, at least at the time, that on a military base, because we were all kind of in that same small environment or that same small society together, plus the fact I lived overseas for most of that time, it was a much more cohesive unit. I don't remember it. I'm sure it existed, and I know it existed, but I don't remember there ever being any discussion of race or any sense that black or brown or any other racial minority was any different than me, simply because we didn't look at it that way. In 1963, I moved to Washington with my father, or with my parents. Really the first time I remember living off of a military base. And I remember very distinctly all of a sudden being confronted with this, what appeared to be a real division, a societal division. And the point I'm getting to is I remember it was either in 5th or 6th grade, which would have been in 63 or 64, sitting in my, I believe it was my 5th grade classroom, could have been my 6th grade classroom, but it was one of those two. I remember my teacher at the time, a woman, wheeled in a television set, and she must have taped some news stories, however they did that back in the day, but I remember her showing for my class scenes from Birmingham, Alabama, with the protesters, the civil rights protesters, and the police letting dogs loose on them, police dogs, with fire hoses, spraying them with fire hoses, and just the level of violence. And that was really the first time I'd seen that, and that was a real eye-opener for me.
Okay. Did you ever hear one of his speeches?
I never heard one of his speeches in person. I've seen them, as most people have, either on the internet or on taped broadcasts. I was if I remember correctly, the I Have a Dream speech, which is the one everybody really associates mostly with King the most, was in August of 1963. We moved back from Germany in June of 1963, right outside of Washington, which was at that time, a little town about, I guess, 20 miles from Washington. It's now part of the whole metropolitan area, but it's called Centerville. And we lived in Centerville, again, 15 to 20 miles out of Washington. And that was at the time that he gave that speech. I wish, even though I was only 10 then, I wish I had had the opportunity to have gone those 20 miles to see that speech, only because it is of such historical significance. But to answer your question, the only time I've heard him speak has been on television or on some kind of a taped or movie.
Right. You said that you lived a lot overseas on military bases. Was it covered overseas, or were people who were overseas outside of the base, were they really interested in that, or was it covered at all?
It was. I'm sure it was. Now, I don't remember, I don't remember sitting down and reading anything or listening to anything. I do recall, Sarah, that, I remember particularly in Germany, because we went to Germany in 1960, so I would have been 7, when we lived there I was 7, 8, and 9, and like any little kid, I wasn't all that interested in what was going on outside my own little world. But we did have the newspaper that we got over there was called the Stars and Stripes. That was distributed to all military families. And I know coverage was in that certainly not the type of coverage you would have gotten in domestic papers like, you know, the Washington Post and the New York Times, the major daily papers over here. Nothing near that coverage. We had no TV then when we were over there, or at least I didn't in my family. And I think any broadcasts would have been German broadcasts if you did have a TV. So the only coverage that I would have had access to would have been probably through that military newspaper, which isn't to say that it wasn't covered, it just wasn't made available to me, nor did I seek it out.
Okay, where were you when you heard Dr. King was killed?
I was probably, again, that was April 4th of '68. I don't know the time of day. I probably was in school, and actually at school. I would have been a freshman in high school. What I remember most about that day was my sister went to a secretarial school in Washington, D.C. And again, we lived just outside. At that time, we'd actually moved closer to D.C. We were probably, I don't know, 10 miles. And I just remember there was some level of concern with my parents about my sister being in Washington in school, and I remember my dad driving down there to pick her up, and I recall that there were, not only in Washington D.C., but of course that was the most important to me for the reason I just gave, but there were riots, there were rioting, there were fires being set. It was like a war zone, literally. Like I said, not just Washington, but when the news was announced that he had been assassinated, in most, or certainly a lot of the major cities in the U.S., the same thing was happening. Riots going on, fires being set, armed violence in the streets, that kind of thing.
Okay, why were they rioting?
Well, again, back then, times were a bit different. There was a lot of fear, basically, and there were a lot of people who were very spun up about certain things, going back again to civil rights, back to the war. People were much more militant back then. There was a lot more protests going on, and I think it was just, you've heard the term powder keg. I think the tensions were so high in this country for a number of different reasons, those two being the primary ones, that all it took was a spark like this to really set this off. And I think there was a real fear, there was a real anger. Dr. King was very popular among the minority population. Even though a lot felt like he wasn't militant enough, I think he was viewed as their spokesman. And when he was assassinated, it just set off all those emotions. Now the other thing is, when he was assassinated, in the hours following that, we didn't know, or no one really knew what had happened. Now, as time progressed, they identified a person, they convicted the person who assassinated him. He didn't appear to have any other agenda other than his own agenda, but at the time, no one knew, and I'm sure there were a lot of conspiracy theories about what had happened, who was involved, whether the U.S. government was involved, and like that.
Okay, who killed him, and who ended up capturing him? Capturing the guy who killed Dr. King.
Okay, now, I hope this is accurate. I know the person who was convicted of killing him, his name was James Earl Ray. He was a guy that was always in trouble with the law. He'd served time in jail. Of course, we're familiar with that, aren't we?
Yeah.
Whether he had help, whether he was part of a larger group, I don't think was ever really established. But he was the single person. He rented a boarding house, a room in a boarding house across the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, where King was shot on the balcony. He shot him with a .30-06 rifle, as I recall. He took off. He got away. He bounced around a little bit. As I recall, Sarah, he ended up overseas, maybe in England, I think, or he was trying to get overseas. But for some reason, I'm thinking he was arrested over there. But regardless, he was arrested. He was tried. He was convicted. He was sentenced to the penitentiary in Tennessee. He escaped at one point. He was recaptured, and he ended up dying of some kind of cancer. I'm going to say liver cancer, perhaps, while he was incarcerated in prison in Tennessee.
You have a lot of experience with prosecuting people and all of that. Was the laws different, or how people handled that a lot different back then than it is today?
I'm sure our laws change constantly. As you probably know, when our legislature writes new laws or amends old laws, those changes typically come in on July 1st. So every July 1st we can have little tweaks, additional laws or tweaks to our existing laws. So certainly between today, looking back, and that's, 68 was how many years ago? 32, 42, 46 years ago? A lot of laws have changed. Things like murder, all the common law kinds of crimes. We're talking about King, we're talking about assassination, we're talking about murder. That law really hasn't changed much. The elements of that haven't changed. And it's the kind of crime that there certainly are consistencies between state and state and state. So I would imagine that at least insofar as the statute exists in Tennessee today, it was very similar, if not the same, as existed back in 1968. Now, what I don't recall is, I assume that he was tried under Tennessee law because that is a state crime as opposed to a federal crime. King was not a candidate of any sort, so I don't think it wasn't a federal prosecution. It would have been a state prosecution. So I think the laws would have been very, very similar, if not the same, to what they are today.
Okay, thank you.
Is that it?